Many people think of history the way it's presented in textbooks as major dates and major personalities, but the history of Carroll County is very different. It's the history of everyday life. It's ordinary people doing ordinary things, and so when you talk about the history, you're describing the thread of everyday living in the patchwork of Carroll County's history. In education circles today, they like to talk about multiculturalism. And the settlement of this region was the true diversity melting pot. We had Pennsylvania Germans migrating into this area from the north. We had a mixture of English, Irish, and Scottish residents coming in from Tidewater, Maryland, around the Chesapeake. We also had African Americans who worked both for the Pennsylvania Germans and the English. And we had a diversity of religions, the Pennsylvania Germans bringing primarily Lutheran and German Reformed religions, and the English bringing the Anglican Church, Quakerism, Methodism, and Episcopalian. One of the ways to interpret the everyday life history of Carroll County is to compare it to national trends. And you see that what was going on in Carroll County is reflected in the social and economic history of our country, especially in the early years. The economy was built around transportation by horse and wagon. So communities developed around intersections of roads or along a turnpike. Every 3 or so miles you would need a tavern and a place to for your horses to get food and water, for you to get food and water. And so the development of communities in Carroll County begins with the economic tradition of serving an agrarian society along major thoroughfares for mule and wagon and horseback. An agrarian society is basically one that is self-sustaining. It produces agricultural crops for the community. And what you found in Carroll County was early settlers establishing farmsteads in the 1730s and 1740s. As they began to prosper, then they needed communities, towns, villages for commercial centers. And so towns started developing in the 1760s to 1790s time frame. And the towns are where you would have located the crafts that were necessary. A wagon maker, a blacksmith, a tanner, a shoemaker. You'd have taverns, you would have your pharmacists, you would have the post office. And so the communities developed around the agrarian society, and all of it was intertwined with the natural resources of the region. As the towns developed in Carroll County, they became transportation centers, sort of the hubs for transporting agricultural goods to market. Primarily routes down to the Port of Baltimore to serve an urban population and for shipping to other locations, but also north into Pennsylvania or west or south into other locations. And as the transportation improved, then agriculture sales also improved, especially during the mid-1800s. And at the time the railroad reached this area in the 1860s, then the agricultural community really prospered. The early settlers frequently farmed and also practiced a trade. And so on a farmstead, you might have a blacksmith shop or you might have a tannery. And one of the things that was very necessary for producing a product from the crops was a grist mill. And so throughout the county, you would get small industrial centers because you had water power. And so the farming used natural resources. The production of the agricultural crops used water power through a water wheel for grinding, for sawing lumber, for a multitude of industrial purposes. And really until the railroad came through and brought a new era of industrialization, your major economy drove upon the water power of the local communities. The area that comprises Carroll County today was originally part of Baltimore County and Frederick County, and the dividing line was Pars Ridge a major geographical feature that runs from Manchester through Westminster to Mount Airy, and it basically runs along Maryland Route 27 today. The early efforts to form a county occurred in the first decade of the 1800s when a group of citizens in Uniontown started a newspaper and petitioned Annapolis to form Union County with Uniontown as the county seat. It took about 3 decades for the citizens to get a new county formed. By the 1830s, the effort moved to Westminster, and the citizens of Westminster petitioned for a new county in 1833, but lost. And the citizens in Manchester pointed their cannons towards Westminster and shot in sort of revenge towards the effort, because it was more convenient for them to go to Towson than to go to Westminster. But by 1837, the General Assembly decided that yes, there was efficiency that could be gained by Westminster as a county seat, and they named the new county in honor of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. One of the interesting ways to look at Carroll County's history in comparison to national trends is to look at the economic history and how things advanced with changing technology. In the early settlements, the transportation was mule and wagon and horseback, and so the towns developed around trading centers, frequently at intersections of roads, such as Manchester, Tawnytown, and Westminster to a lesser extent, being at major crossroads of turnpikes. As the county developed and the nation developed, we began to get railroad transportation as the major form of an economic driving force. And all of the communities in Carroll County wanted access to the railroad. Uniontown's a good example of a very prosperous village during the Turnpike era that did not get railroad, and therefore has all of the charm and characteristics of a pre-railroad village. When the railroad came to the community, along the southern edge of the county, Sykesville and Mount Airy prospered. Around the center of the community of the county, Westminster, New Windsor, and Union Bridge prospered. Tawnytown was a railroad center, and Hampstead was a railroad center. And so you see sort of this national trend of the railroad's influence in bringing new products, new ideas to communities. And then in the early 20th century, with the development of the automobile, we see another major change in the county. And car transportation becomes a major feature in not only the local economy, but the daily habits of the residents of the county. Whereas in the horse and wagon and rail era, people generally lived in the community where they worked, where they went to school, where they were members of social clubs, where they found their own entertainment. Now with the automobile, they'd go to a neighboring village to go to the movies, they'd drive down to Baltimore to have a job, and you see the whole fabric of the local social community change, going from horseback to rail to car transportation. Manchester was one of the more prosperous communities in the county during the early agrarian stage, where travel was primarily by horse or wagon. Actually, Tawnytown and Manchester probably were the two most prominent communities, because both of them were at intersections of major turnpikes, both of them being early Indian trails that the early settlers adapted for turnpike transportation. Manchester developed in 2 phases. It was initially laid out by an Englishman, Richard Richards, but predominantly settled by Pennsylvania Germans coming from the north in Pennsylvania. And so it had a very strong Pennsylvania German character in the architecture of the town and in the social traditions of the town. One of the interesting ways to look at Carroll County's history is by comparing the development of towns. And so you have Manchester as a very prosperous agrarian community in the early 1800s, and its sort of sister city is Hampstead, which had not developed as much. There weren't as many houses along the main street. There weren't as many side roads that had developed. But then when the railroad came, both communities vied for a railroad to come here. Manchester formed a Parkton to Manchester Railroad Company and began construction, but Hampstead was able to get a rail line earlier, and then it became really the economic center of the area. So you can look at the main streets, you can look at the architecture, you can look at the types of business in those two towns and see that Manchester is very much the pre-railroad prosperous community, and Hampstead has the industries that would have used the rail line, like a lumber yard and like the rail depot, and into the early 20th century was the center for economic development in this region. In response, Manchester's industry changed to be an industry that did not need heavy transportation. And so you had a lot of cigar factories located on Main Street. Making cigars is a labor-intensive industry that does not need heavy manufacturing. They were rolled by hand. They could be transported by a horse-drawn carriage down to the rail lines. You also had a lot of clothing factories and clothing manufacturing industry located in Manchester after its heyday as an agricultural center. Another trend in economic history that you see in Carroll County tracking national trends is the consolidation of industry into large manufacturing processes. You can see this in a number of industries that continued from early 1900s to the mid-1900s, such as the cigar factories, the clothing manufacturing. The best example of local industries that get lost because of national consolidation of the economy are the canning factories. Almost every town in Carroll County had a canning factory on its outskirts. It allowed the farmers to get their produce to processing easier. They did not have heavy transportation costs. And so the local canneries had a summer schedule of canning tomatoes and corn and beans and peas, and it provided summer jobs for young people, regular summer jobs for trained people in the community. But by the 1960s, you see a nationalization of food processing, and the local canneries lost out to the competition in primarily the Midwest or by really large operations like in Hanover, Pennsylvania. Manchester today is like many of Carroll County's communities where many of the residents commute out of town for employment. And so it has some small businesses, usually mom and pop owned businesses that provide services to the community, but is, like many of Carroll County's towns, a commuter town as far as the employment of residents is concerned. One of the trends in county history from the 1950s to today is increasing suburbanization of the county. So there are fewer people engaged in agricultural pursuits. The economy is less agricultural and more involved in suburban type activity. Especially over that time period, home building and construction, the development industry has been a major player in Carroll County's economy. So today's residents are more inclined to be those who shop outside of the county, work outside of the county, and have many of their recreational activities outside of the county. Hampstead is similar to Manchester in that it was laid out by an Englishman, Christopher Vaughan, but settled primarily by Pennsylvania Germans coming south from Pennsylvania. It did not develop a community core the same way Manchester did, but it did have a couple of taverns. One of them was known as Spring Garden. There was Sapp's Tavern. They had what you would expect in terms of local craftsmen, tinsmith, blacksmith, tanners. And once the railroad came to town, then it really prospered with late 19th century businesses and industry. In today's Hampstead, you've got one of the more prosperous industrial and economic developments within the entire county. Black & Decker led that surge by opening a plant in the early 1950s that expanded through the 1970s and provided a lot of jobs in the manufacturing industry in this region. In that sort of industrial core, there have been other industries that have located there, predominantly Joseph A. Banks Clothiers and Sweetheart Cup. And so Hampstead's one of the towns in the county that has done an excellent job in attracting industry and keeping jobs local. Another interesting aspect of Carroll County's history with the coming of the railroad is that it occurred the same time as the Civil War. And in fact, accounts of Gettysburg talk about how the Union Army had appointed a general to work with the railroads to provide munitions and supplies to the Civil War. And Westminster and Taneytown were integral parts of the Battle of Gettysburg supply lines for Union forces. The railroad in Taneytown after the Civil War also provided a strong economic base with early 20th century industries in Taneytown that continue to today. Westminster has an interesting history as the line of demarcation between the English-influenced settlers and the Pennsylvania German settlers. And so in the architecture in Westminster, you see a lot of English traditions, especially in some of the earlier buildings. And it was an agricultural community that was not as prosperous as Taneytown or Manchester. But once the county was formed in 1837, it then became the center for many county activities, such as having a newspaper, being the center of the county courts, and so having the center for law and lawyers and the seat of government. And with that came some prestige, came some economic development that wouldn't occur elsewhere. And then with the railroad, Western Maryland Railroad extension to Westminster in the 1860s, it became the true commercial center for Carroll County. As the center of county government and the commercial center for the county, Westminster has been the trendsetter, especially during the 1900s. The first major highway bypass was built in Westminster, Route 140, opened in 1954. When Jay Grabio and I were at the Historical Society, we did an exhibit that focused on the building of Route 140 and the symbolism that gave to the community. It was almost like a little bit of Southern California comes to the county, a divided two-lane highway, a focus for economic development. The first fast food hamburger joint was built there. And so Westminster has been the trendsetter in attracting sort of the highlights that you would think of 20th century history. Fast food, drive-in movies, apartment living, and those types of suburban features that maybe some of the other counties were slower to catch up to. With rapid growth, Westminster's seen a lot of problems that are typical of rapid suburbanization. Traffic congestion on the major thoroughfares as well as the side roads, overcrowding of schools, tight water resources, those types of things that Carroll County as a whole has struggled with, and Westminster in particular has had to deal with. The early settlers came here because of the natural resources of the county, rich limestone soils for agriculture, but they also integrated with the county in their architecture. And so the architecture reflects stone quarried locally, bricks burned on the site where the house was constructed. And there also was some mining done in the county because of the natural resources that were here, and because transportation was limited. In the 1700s and early 1800s, there was copper mined in the Sykesville area. There were slate quarries which provided roofing materials for local structures. There were limestone quarries which were burned in kilns locally to provide lime for building construction as well as for farmers' fields. And so you get a sense that the early residents were very much in tune with their natural resources and the way that the land and the water resources played in their daily lives. A good example of mining in the county is there were iron ore beds that in the late 1800s became prominent for the iron resources and steel making. And because there was a good source of iron ore here, there were railroad lines developed just to bring the ore up to smelting in Pittsburgh and other locations in Pennsylvania. One of those rail lines was the Bachman Valley Railroad Company, which served a iron ore mine known as the Bachman Valley Ore Mine near Melrose, north of Manchester in Carroll County. And that rail line was in existence from about 1880 to 1927 when there was an accident at the mine and the mine fell out of use and the railroad fell out of use shortly thereafter. But Melrose became a little bit of a commercial center because it had a rail line. It developed a lumber yard. The canning factory there canned tomatoes and had a ready resource for transportation to get their product out. And so it's a sort of unique example of how the railroad would affect a community and how the natural resources in the region developed the local economy. When we talk about the ordinary life of Carroll County residents, that doesn't mean that there weren't people who became prominent in their fields in the county. A good example is William Henry Reinhardt, a late 19th century artist and sculptor. He was raised in McKinstry's Mills outside of Union Bridge. In that area, the limestone has some hard formations that creates a marble. And as a young boy, he learned his craft of sculpturing in marble that came out of the Wakefield Valley. He later went to Baltimore and studied in a studio, and then was recognized as a major artistic talent in America at the time. He also studied and had studios in Italy and England, and is known for some major works in this region, including the brass doors at the Capitol were his design, and similar sculptures. Carroll County's African American history is very rich in local traditions and sites. It was not unusual for the Pennsylvania German families to have one or two slaves, either as household servants or farm hands, who they would manumit or set free in their will. In the southern part of the county, there was more of a plantation and tobacco-oriented culture, but it never developed as much as southern Maryland and the Chesapeake region. And so you might have more of slaves working on larger farms. But for the most part, the county was small farmsteads, and the slaves were farm hands on those types of operations. The unique feature, I think, is that by 1860, the time of the Civil War, the African American population was almost 50% free black and 50% slave. So it shows that there was a tradition within the local culture of manumitting slaves on an owner's death. And because there were that number of free blacks in the county, Carroll County became a location for Underground Railroad operations with trying to gain the freedom of slaves in the South by moving them through the county into parts further north where they could be free. One of the aspects of community development in Carroll County was the fact that with a large free black population, there typically were villages or portions of towns that became the homes of the free blacks who owned their own land and owned their own home. And local residents know many of these locations. Some are gone, such as Black Ankle outside of Westminster, but some still remain. Priestland outside of Union Bridge was an African-American rural community with a small village center, an African-American church, and an African-American store. Dorseytown outside of Mount Airy. There was a tradition that the freed African-Americans would locate in a village of their own or at one end of town in a 4 or 5 housing lots together. And then they would work with the local industry or work in households in that community and serve as a small community, usually with their own church and their own social traditions. During the 1800s, the primary source of power was water, which is sort of odd for us to think about with high gas prices today and gasoline being our primary source of power, not only for automobiles but for electric power plants and other industrial uses. But water was the power of the era, primarily harnessed through mills, which had water wheels, which turned a turbine that then affected belts and shafts. And we think of the traditional use of water power as being to grind grain. Union Mills and the north central Carroll County is a great example of a grist mill run by water power based upon the 1700s traditions of a grist mill. But water power was also harnessed for many other industrial uses. Sawing of lumber, sawmills were run by water power, making of paper in paper factories out at Hoffman Mills, running other equipment for textiles and other types of industry. Water was harnessed for many different types of industrial processes. I think the hallmark of the agrarian society was the ability to self-sustain individual households. And that meant that they made their own foods, whether it was crops that they grew, whether they had a vegetable garden, whether it was local naturally grown plants and flowers. There were cranberry bogs outside of Westminster. There are blueberry and raspberry locations throughout the county. And they all not only dealt with their own food, but they made their clothes. They tanned hides from livestock. Just the full panoply of household activities that would occur were things that were done within their household. As we track our national trends, we see the development of the county from an agrarian society with self-sustaining farms into an agribusiness where the produce is no longer locally canned, but the agricultural product is part of a national economic system. You see that similar trend with other industries that were taking place in Carroll County, where you really have a national industrial base, and the actions and activities in Carroll County feed into the national economy. And then in the late 1900s, we begin to move into a technological society, and that's where we are right now. We're probably in the early years of a technology-based society. But we can see with our children and our grandchildren a whole new world, a whole new life experience in the influence that computers have had on their daily lives and opening up markets that are not national but international markets, and opening up exchange of information and intellectual challenges through the internet and through the rapidly expanding technology in this region. Although Carroll County had an agrarian society in the early 20th century, that does not mean that we weren't hard hit by the Depression. Farms were foreclosed on, banks went under. The banks that were in the county were locally owned banks. They were, the leadership were local residents, the staff and members were local residents, and these had traumatic impacts on those families at that time in the county's history. You also had, during that era, Prohibition, which had a major impact on the county because in a farming community, there was access to grain alcohol. The grain alcohol was not controlled, and if you flip through the daily, weekly newspapers of that time, you see that alcoholism and major reactions of crime and domestic violence occurred during Prohibition because residents in the county were drinking grain alcohol and going crazy. Carroll County today is very appealing as a residential community, and that's because of the traditions that come out of 100 years, 200 years of history here. I think that new residents are attracted to the county because of an excellent system of education. The schools do a very good job of educating youngsters in the community. The amenities of a former agricultural community in terms of open space, in terms of farmers markets with available local produce, in terms of scenic countryside and a high quality of life is what attracts people to the county, and which residents who have lived here a long time also enjoy. If you look around the county, you're always looking at some aspect of history. It may be a brick design in a brick end barn. It may be a fancy Victorian cornice on a house on Main Street. It may be a stone wall or an old stone mill. But throughout the county, there are always architectural features and landscape features that remind us of our history and make this a very rewarding place to live. When you look at the earliest settlers, I think you stand in awe of how close they were to their natural surroundings. Occasionally you find references in journals or diaries that were kept by early residents, and they talk about the cold winter weather, and they tried to put a piece of leather up against a window to to block the snow and the cold winds. And so our earliest residents were very hardy because of their closeness to nature. They built their houses out of the materials that were close at hand. They got their water from the spring house that either was in the basement of their house or just outside the kitchen door. They had a very close relationship with the land and knowing when to plant crops and when to harvest crops and how to work the soil to the best benefit. And then they used other local resources, whether it was through mining or timbering or other means of getting resources for every aspect of their daily life. When somebody 50, 100 years from now looks back at Carroll County today, I think the theme will be, how does a traditional agrarian society transition into a national suburban community? And there are a lot of aches and pains in doing that. Our political leaders understand that very well, that it's not easy to make that tradition from a low population, agricultural-oriented community to a higher density suburban community. And I think that's what the historians 50 to 100 years from now will be looking at and exploring and discussing in great detail. If you look at our national issues in the United States today, energy, the high cost of gasoline, the rough cycle that we're in with our economy are major factors affecting people's daily lives today. And so as we look at our daily lives and what we do, it's interesting to see a return to some of the techniques and methods of our ancestors. Reading the local media, there are stories about people collecting rainwater through their rain spouts in order to have a water resource for watering the garden and plants. People are looking for producing their own energy. Even something as simple as putting up a clothesline and hanging their clothes on the back line instead of running a dryer in the household. And so in the stage we're in right now, it's pretty amazing to see that we're returning to many of the types of things that our ancestors did, having a small garden in the backyard, preparing our own foods, looking for savings in energy resources because of the national conditions that exist today.